Benedicite Dominus. Today's topic is question 122 of the Secunda Secundae, the final topic in the under the cardinal virtue of justice. This week we have the Precepts of Justice, which is a pretty lengthy section, so we'll jump right into it. The precepts of justice deal with, well, let's use the first term, precept, which is a command or an order or a direction. Uh, uh, this looks specifically at when you're looking at what are the precepts of justice, what are the commands of justice. St. Thomas uses the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments establish what is true justice. There's 6 different articles in this section. Most of them are asking, is the first commandment proper? Which the contra is often maybe St. Paul or St. Augustine or some reference to a particular person. This one, kind of ironically, it just kind of feeds back to you. It says, well, Scripture says it is. So, is the first commandment correct? Well, yes, because it's the first commandment. Um, so some of them are somewhat self-reflexive. If you're reading it as well, trying to figure it out, it's kind of you kind of already know what the answer is going to be. St. Thomas isn't going to go against Scripture alone. That said, I think there's still very many interesting things along with this within these sections. Um, he breaks down the Ten Commandments into 3 different sections. The first 3 are the chief parts of justice, and they typically deal with acts of religion. Um, the next one deals with piety, the virtue of piety, and it's the second part of justice. And the last one, which is the last 6, is all one topic itself, and that's common justice, which is observed among equals. Those are the ones that secular people, if they do appreciate the Ten Commandments, they often point to the last 6: "Thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not bear false witness," things like that. Those are the kind of common ones that when people say the basis of American laws reside on things like the Ten Commandments, often what they're pointing to is the final 6, because American law isn't really based on the elements of religion, since uh, most secular laws aren't aiming at religion, and even the fourth one, which is respect to your parents, does not. We don't have laws that codify that either. So go into the different points of it. The bigger question in Article 1 is, what is the purpose of law? Which I think is an interesting philosophical question that maybe we don't ask enough. So often people talk about separation of church and state, but then what is the question of, in general, what is the purpose of law? St. Thomas says the intention of law is to make all people virtuous. Well, that's an interesting perspective. I don't think when we're really building laws or getting rid of laws that we're thinking, does this law make people more virtuous or not? That isn't being asked maybe often enough. That's a good point. Um, give precepts about those things where duty is most prevalent. The precepts are duties which we need the most. They're the most important duties that we owe to God, to our family, to our community. So that's that kind of 3 areas where the Ten Commandments focuses on, which establishes again justice. When we talk about that's unjust or social justice, well, is it against God? Is it against family? Is it against neighbor? Really, those are the 3 groups that it can be against. Um, so one of the questions, the objections is that Ten Commandments aren't really dealing with justice, because really it's all about love. The Ten Commandments is about charity, love of God and love of neighbor. Um, that's true. The Ten Commandments are about love of God, the first three, love of neighbor, the last seven. So true. But really, charity, caritas, love, is one of those things that's closest to the final end of beatitudo. It's a final end. It doesn't mean it can't be something in its own right as well. So what St. Thomas says is yes, the end of the Ten Commandments is in fact love, charity, uh, but along the way, the immediate acts refer to acts of justice. So, how do you get to that final love? Well, you have to act justly. The virtues are interrelated, and they're all aiming towards that final end, that union with God, which is going to have more of a sense of higher ideals of charity. But they all are aiming there. When we break down the Ten Commandments, he breaks down the first ones individually, and then the last six get lumped together again. But the first commandment, uh, you shall not have strange gods before me. Thou shalt not make thyself a graven image, and thou shalt not adore them nor serve them. So the first commandment, the first precept, has three acts to the first precept. So it's not these aren't three separate commandments. It's one commandment with three parts. Um, uh, he said, "Well, how can the Ten Commandments be so good? Maybe the first commandment shouldn't even be in there, and it's starting with a negative. Uh, thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not. Why? Um, if this is an act of justice, why are we starting with the negative? Why the negative? Um, well, St. Thomas says a house first needs a good foundation. uh, the soul needs a good foundation and goodness of will. To get a good will, first you have to clean house. You have to wipe out all of the garbage first. So if you're starting with the sense of having false gods before you, then nothing else is going to work. It's like building a house on sand. It won't stand against the winds and the waves if you build the house on sand. The same thing as if you start your precepts of justice on false ground. So first is clear the path, set a strong foundation. So the first one is, again, by the clearing out, it does start with the negative sense. Um, and you have to understand, that you have to, at the beginning of a journey, you have to know where you're headed to. So if the end of the process of justice is God, then you have to recognize who God is on step one. If you don't know where he is on step one, then you don't know where you're actually heading. Um, St. Thomas quotes a line from the prophet Jeremiah: "Break up anew your fallow ground and sow not upon it thorns." Sow not upon thorns. You can't plant a crop among thorns. Separation of the wheat and from the chaff, or the separation of the planting of crops, the wheat among the weeds that God has to weed out at the end. If you pull out the weeds in the you'll pull out the wheat. So you got to first clear the ground so that you're not mixing good in with bad from the start. Um, the chief obstacle to religion is for man to adhere to a false God. I think that's an interesting point, something that maybe Bishop Robert Barron might talk about sometimes. Um, it, People in our society are often responding against religion. People are very often irreligious, but maybe it's because their first step uh, is towards a false god. That maybe it's easy to tear down the idea of God when it's a false god to begin with. It's hard to tear down the true God. Uh, Not as much of a straw man, the true God. It's easier to pull down spaghetti monsters. So you cannot serve both God and mammon. Another great line in there, which is true. If your idea of God is mammon, you can't serve the true God if you're serving mammon, which is the false God. Even if it's just not money or something that, but just your idea of God, which isn't true. The second commandment, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord in vain. Again, another thou shalt not, kind of a negative command from the beginning. Again, more language within the Summa of you need to clear the ground in order to set it up right. Um, uh, Virtue is necessary to remove obstacles to true religion before establishing him in true religion. So you first have to get rid of those obstacles. And St. Thomas in this third article spends most of his time really talking about what true religion is more than the name. But I think that still he has a good reason for it. The Catechism and talks about God calls each one by name. Everyone's name is sacred. The name is an icon of the person. It demands respect as a sign and dignity of the one who bears it. If that's true for each one of us, how much more for the name of God? If you go to the Catechism, you can find a lot more writings about how the name, the many dimensions of what it means to have a name. Um, we'll just stick with St. Thomas in the Summa. This is already long enough without pulling in too many outside sources to it. When he talks about the opposition of true religion in Article 3, um, we won't go into these individually because we've already done this in questions 93, 94 through question 100, where we talk about the excesses and the deficiencies of the virtue of religion. So one of the shortcomings of religion, or one of the deficiencies of religions of irreligion would be to the blasphemy of the name of God, or to perjure His name. All right. St. Thomas uses the term. He says, "This is like having a short blanket, and you're in bed with the true God and the false God. The bed isn't big enough. The blanket isn't big enough for both of you. Um, Somebody will get knocked out of the bed, either the real God or the false God. But it can't. But you can't. You don't have room for both. Have room for false gods and true God." Um, the third commandment is see that you keep the Sabbath because it is a sign between me and your generation. So they point out in this one that this is the first positive commandment. It's not a thou shalt not, it's a thou shalt. So the ground has been cleared. It's now time to set up something positive in terms of relationship with God. The third precept describes an exterior worship of God using the sensible signs. The first two are more of an interior process of having right relationship. This is We have those three uh, precepts about our relationship to God and justice. Two of them are interior, but this last one is an exterior sign of that interior devotion. If God, another line from the Catechism, if God rested and was refreshed on the seventh day, man too ought to rest and should let others, especially the poor, be refreshed. The Sabbath brings everyday work to a halt and provides respite. It is a day to protest against the servitude of work and the worship of money. Very powerful section of the Catechism. Uh, well, the questions in this article is is this simply ceremonial, or is this a moral code in the Ten Commandments? Keep holy the Sabbath. Is that a moral thing, or is that just a ceremonial thing? Is this if it's ceremonial, in some ways, shouldn't this be in the book of Leviticus or Deuteronomy? Shouldn't this be under the Levitical code for the temple? Isn't this a temple issue? How did it make it into the Ten Commandments, which is typically seen as a moral code? How is temple worship in the moral code? And what St. Thomas points out is a certain time set aside for the occupying oneself with divine things is a matter of a moral precept. So he's saying, no, it is a moral thing. If you're not setting aside time for God, then that is an injustice. It's an injustice towards God. It is a moral matter, um, not just a ceremonial one. He says, insofar as it is a ceremonial element to it, so the aspect of it is allegorical, has allegorical significance, meaning it has moral significance. So it's a sign of a ceremony, but it's also pointing to something greater than it. Um, so what does the Sabbath point to? Well, it points to Christ's rest in the tomb. Uh, it points to a day of rest from sinning. If you're not working, you're not out there doing this, you're taking a rest from sin, which might be the time you need to pause, think about things, and then start your week in a different direction than the last week. Um, the mind's resting God is another line he uses. So the mind, what does one do on the Sabbath? One rests one mind and allows it to rest in God. And it also foreshadows the enjoyment of God in heaven. So these things are not something that's a historical fact. They're something that is lived out in the morality of the everyday life. So it's both ceremonial in an allegorical way, and it's also a moral code. And he points out, and I thought this was really a point for some good meditation within one's own prayer life, is that God sets certain times aside. And the example he gives of things like sleeping or eating, I think are particularly interesting because um, they are very internal, right? It's not just setting time aside. Um, as we kind of natural like I think the way we think of it is like it would be a very unnatural thing to set that time aside, the Sabbath aside, right? We want to work, but we have to force ourselves not to work. It's very unnatural. We're fighting against it. It's almost one of these purity code ideas that we're doing it just to be countercultural. But what St. Thomas points to is this idea that there's a natural rhythm to our lives that is natural, right? Um, Without telling people, most people want to go to sleep sometime when it gets dark. When the sun comes up, people want to wake up. Most people, unless they have a job or whatever situation in life is forcing them to do it, most people don't choose to go to bed when it gets light out and choose to wake up when it gets dark. We're not within our bodies nocturnal animals the way that bats are nocturnal. We're not nocturnal animals. Our bodies tell us this is the time to rest. This is the time to wake up. Most people want 7, 8, 9 hours, within that range. Most people don't want 1 hour. Most people don't want 12 hours. Most people kind of want the same thing. It must be an something built within our bodies which tell us when to rest and how much rest to get, because it seems to be a fairly universal thing within a few hours of one another. The same thing with eating, right? We all might have slightly different eating patterns, but most of the time when we wake up, we're a little bit hungry. We want something to drink, we want something to eat, we have to go to the bathroom, we want to wash our faces, put on deodorant, brush our teeth. There's things we all kind of, if we skip it, doesn't quite feel right. Um, Maybe some people skip breakfast, but if you work at a regular office job, when it comes time to lunch, your body is ready for it. There's nobody who's not ready for lunch. And then at the end of the workday, we want to get home, and we're also one of the first things we do. We want to get something to eat when we get back, or when we're done with work for the day. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner, whether whatever country you're in, is an element of this, right? Even if some meals are bigger in some cultures than others, some people have a big lunch, some people have a big dinner, some people have a big breakfast, some people only have a snack for breakfast. Some things depend on culture, but these meals that are, the three different points a day is kind of seems to be maybe something that's built in. We have names for it: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. We don't have names for other times a day. We just call them all snacks, right? We have specific ones. So there's an internal sense of time for something to be done. Within greater nature, we can see that, especially if you're from the north, when springtime comes, everything is moving in that direction. The buds come out, the bugs come out, the weather starts to change, the grass starts turning greener, it's raining more. Like everything sees it coming. And when the fall's coming, it starts getting colder, the sun goes down, the trees start losing their leaves, the gardens start to die. People start to stay in more and eat more, right? All of nature complies with these certain times. The same thing would be true with the Sabbath. The Sabbath, in some ways, is exactly like all of this. Um, why do we rest on the Sabbath? Because that's the time. That's the time. It's like going to bed, right? It is the natural order of the world to take this time uh, for the divine, for service of the divine, and for rest. Now, what can you do on the Sabbath is a question. Because this is, for anyone from the Christian background, which I most imagine if you're watching this, you probably are. Um, the Jewish people have a fairly strict sense of what you can and cannot do on the Sabbath, particularly Orthodox Jews. At the time of Jesus, there was a strong sense of what you can and cannot. Jesus kind of pushed the limits of this. Um, so for Christians, we sometimes take more liberality, not in a Thomistic sense. We take a more free approach to this. Um, but he said there's three different types of activities that are of service, of work that we do. One is when a person is a servant of sin, and he uses the Gospel of St. John just to talk about people who are in service of sin. Well, if you're acting out of the service of sin, you should stop that. Well, it's particularly on the Sabbath. You should stop serving sin on the Sabbath. That was this idea of on the Sabbath we cease sinning, right? On the Sabbath. If you're otherwise a servant to sin, stop sinning at least one day a week, right? On the Sabbath. The second one is a servant to another as a physical laborer. Um, if you work for Walmart, you work for Amazon, you work for the grocery store, whatever you work for another person in terms of your labor. Uh, that is supposed to stop on the Sabbath. The Sabbath is supposed to be rest for the servants of others. So if you have people who work for you, you should give them time off to celebrate the Sabbath. You should honor the Sabbath. And if you can, you should honor the Sabbath by not working for somebody on Sunday. Um, the servant to God, though, is the third one. And that one, if you ever hang around organists or priests, music ministers or priests, they always talk about everybody is supposed to get Sunday off, but we don't. We never get any holy days off. We don't get Christmas off. We don't get Easter off. We don't get Sundays off. Well, that's exactly how it should be, according to St. Thomas. The priesthood, even St. Thomas said it in the Summa, even the Jewish priesthood, the priests always have to work on the Sabbath. That's just as part of the life of being a priest. Um, but and he also mentioned readers and other people. So those who are involved in liturgical church ministry, you don't get it. You don't get time off. You have to work, and that's because you're not serving another. You're serving God. If you serve God, you're not. That is a day where everybody should be serving God. So if you're a priest, especially, you should be serving God. The other example he gave is corporal works, which I think really, he didn't say of mercy, but it really, when you look at the context, he seems to be talking about corporal works of mercy. And I think you can always put in spiritual works because the second commandment about physical labor for another doesn't include spirit, doesn't say anything about spiritual. Um, so on the Sabbath, you can always feed the hungry. You can always give strength to the thirsty, shelter the homeless, clothe the naked, visit the sick, visit the imprisoned, bury the dead. You can always do that on the Sabbath. Because that's in service to God. That's a corporal work. He also points out that people in healthcare. somebody who's taking care of the sick can of course work, because that, or you can always feed yourself. You don't have to worry about, can I cook on the Sabbath? Of course you can cook on the Sabbath. You can take care of your bodily needs. You can see the doctor if you need to go to the doctor, and you can do that for other people who need it. So he points that out. Um, God, man was, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, as a line. There's many examples of Jesus helping people on the Sabbath. Because if you can heal somebody on the Sabbath, then doctors and nurses can work on the Sabbath. Um, this fourth commandment is a interesting one. It's the one that stands alone, and that is the honor of honoring your father and mother. Another positive one, right? It's not a thou shalt not. It's a positive one. Um, and he said, of our neighbors, which love God and neighbor, of our neighbor, the one we owe the greatest debt to are our parents. Of everything we owe to people within our society, what we owe the most to our parents, because they are our principle. God is our spiritual principle as creator of us and the universe. But our parents are the next closest type of principle to our creator. Um, and he talks about this a lot in under the topic of the virtue of piety in question 101 here. So we won't have to repeat all of this, because go back to that question 101. And this is loyalty and faithfulness to particularly your father, your parents. Um, and he does talk about material support too. He said really this is loyalty to our parents. This is being there for them, looking after them. It's not directly talking about paying. Are you paying for your parents? But he does say in an indirect way, you do have an accidental duty, not an intrinsic duty. It's not true for everyone. A lot of people, their parents are richer than them, so you don't owe material wealth to your parents. But in instances where your parents are in material poverty, right, that they are, you don't let your parents become homeless. You don't let your parents go without when they are in hard times. And he points out slavery. If your parent has become a slave and you have the means to ransom them, you should ransom your parents. You owe that to them. Now, that's not true for everyone, because most people, their parents don't become slaves. Most people, their parents don't become indigent. But if you're a person who your parents do, then you should try to offer material support. Um, the Catechism points out this commandment includes and presupposes the duties of parents and those who govern and all who exercise authority over others and over our community of persons. So they expand this to anybody who has kind of a valid authority over us. Do we honor those who God has put as our principles, our leaders? The last six commandments are all thou shalt not statements, and they are issues of equality. So these are the first three were our relationship with God. The next is our parents, who are above us. They are our principles. And then these are our equals. Uh, so thou shalt not, thou shalt not. We'll go into the justice uh, uh, is due to people in general. So this is not a special virtue. Um, this is justice due to all people within our society. It often says your neighbor's wife, your neighbor's goods. By neighbor, we mean all people. Anyone we're in contact with is our neighbor. Um, so it's in general to everyone, not to a particular person, right? The fourth commandment is to honor our parents. That's not general. That's particular to our parents. The rest of these are general. And it pays to all indifferently, right? This is justice. This is in some ways the blind scales of justice. We owe this to people regardless of who they are or how we know them. our relationship with them. We just owe them this duty not to murder them, whether we know them or not to steal from them, not to bear false witness against them, not to covet after their belongings or their spouses. This is indifferent to their particular individual personhood and their relationship to us. These commandments are inclusive. Now, this is an interesting one because when I was younger, often a lot of CCD classes, religious classes, those big colorful books that didn't go into a lot of Thomism. They talked about, if you gossip about your friend, in some ways you're slandering them, therefore it's murder. So, it's kind of falls into that. I thought, well, that's kind of them just trying to make it more relevant to us. But really, it's a Thomistic principle, this idea. And his perspective is that these commandments are not intended to be narrowly defined. This isn't just about narrow definitions of murder. Like if somebody said, well, how about second degree murder? How about manslaughter? It doesn't say thou shalt not commit manslaughter. Well, you're missing the point. In terms of the American legal system, we can narrowly define things lots of times. It's not technically the letter of the law, so therefore it's not the law. Burglary, entering a dwelling at nighttime in order to commit a felony. Well, if it's not at night, then it's not burglary. Well, that is a very fine distinction. This is not intended to be like this. This is intended to be as inclusive as possible. So he said, why is this the Ten Commandments? Why are there only 10? Why are these such a big, why is this so big? People sometimes pick on them because they don't include things like genocide. They don't include things like rape. They don't include these other things which we could think might be worse than what's in there. Well, it's because you miss the spirit of this because it's more inclusive than that. So, all injuries related against your neighbor's personhood are included in murder. Well, that includes mugging somebody. That includes physically attacking somebody. That includes assault and battery. That includes assassinating their character. That includes any type of violence in any way towards any other person would be falling under this category of murder. In some sense, these are allegorical. In some sense, they're pointing to some bigger truth. Um, Anything that deals with lust of any kind. This includes pornography. This includes infidelity. It's all adultery. So we're dealing with all things that deal with things against the personhood of another person, anything that deals with the lust of another person, anything that's damaging another person's property is theft, right? So it's just, again, making a bigger statement about everything. It's not just about stealing one thing, it's anything that deals with damaging another's property, doing anything to another person's property. And anything done through speech is to bear false witness, unless maybe it's to destroy another person's, by telling the truth, destroying another person, then it could be under even maybe murder in a sense. But you could see this where Christ himself says, anyone who looks lustfully at a woman has already committed lust within his soul, within his self. Anybody who says terrible things, they've already done it. They've already done it just by thinking it, just by doing it. It's included into the bigger sin. Um, and then lastly, he kind of points out this idea of the last two, which are coveting. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's property. Said, if you look at this, why don't they say, thou shalt not, this in some sense isn't coveting wishing, it's not actual action, right? I want my neighbor's wife, I want my neighbor's belongings. It's not the same thing as stealing your neighbor's wife or stealing your neighbor's property. But so if that's so bad to even think it, well, isn't thinking murder worse than thinking theft? So why don't we have a commandment against not thinking about murder. Um, and St. Thomas points this out that it's really about concupiscence. The last two are about concupiscence, this desire within the soul to acquire. Um, uh, and it's and he says you don't want to go too far with this, and this is a good distinction. That anybody who has this desire, this strong desire, repeated desire, um, of the senses. You see this woman or man that you're really attracted to. That's not a sin. It's not a sin to have desire. It's not a sin to have an emotional reaction to something that makes you want it. You see the really beautiful car and you go, oh, I want it. You see the beautiful house with the view of the mountains and the ocean, you go, oh, I want it. There's nothing sinful about wanting it. Unless you have a consent of the will, you have turned your will over to it. So that is what he's talking about. People who have coveted, they've seen something they want. Oh, I want it. Now they said, I'm gonna get it. Right? There's some action. There has been a consent of the will. Now there might not have been an act in an outward sense of acquiring it, but there has been an act internally to say, I'm going to get it. In some ways, it's like the Lord of the Rings, the moment Smeagol decides that he's going to deceive them in the ring. I'm going to lead them to the lair, uh, and they'll get eaten, and then I'll take their ring. Right in that moment, he decides he's going to deceive them. That's that. Uh, that's that consent of the will to do it. So there's been an action, an internal movement towards it. There's been a step towards actually not just desiring it, but getting it. So he said that's an important part. And he said, um, this is different than murder when it comes to concupiscence, because the thing that people desire with coveting the neighbor's wife, coveting the neighbor's possessions, is they're actually, in some sense, seeking a good. The neighbor's wife or husband, well, they're good people. You should, if you were single and they were single, you should, maybe you would want to desire that person. Right? There's nothing wrong with that person. So it's not evil, right? It's not evil in itself if the circumstances were different. Um, same would be of their neighbors' goods. So they have a beautiful house, a beautiful yard, and a nice car. Well, one day you could have something like that. That would be wonderful. The problem with it is that it belongs to your neighbor. That's the problem. The problem is who it belongs to, and that you're not him. Um, so it's not wanting the bad; it's wanting the good under a different situation. So murder is different than that. There is never a proper ordering of murder. And he said that what you really desire when it's murder is some type of horror. You're looking for the horror. You're not looking for the murder. Versus if you want the neighbor's wife, you really want the neighbor's wife. What you desire is actually what you desire. Um, when you want to murder, you don't really want the murder. You want whatever the horror is that comes from it. Um, so why are these last two important? Because a lot of this has been about the proper ordering in relationship with God, internally and externally, right? In internal disposition and action, clearing out the garbage and setting a good foundation. Um, right relationship with parents and superiors, which could include parents, church, um, government, right? If you're a student, school, your school, right? The proper relationship to authority figures, and then getting into some basic elements of protecting one another's property, correct speech, uh, not being lustful of our neighbor, not trying to damage our neighbor. Well, that's almost everything. Well, what else is there? Well, now there's this inner disposition that we should be aiming for. These last two are dealing with properly ordering our concupiscence, properly ordering our wills towards the good outside of us. Well, what's outside of us? Well, the things that we struggle with the most outside of us is lust, our neighbor's wife, and envy of our neighbor's stuff. So we should properly order our relationship to stuff and people. So I think that again, that's very brilliant. uh, Correct actions towards it, and then also in changing the internal disposition, which is the final part, which is important, in some sense, a very important part of it, that you have the right internal dispositions for right relationship with other people and things within our lives. So, and I think just to step back, and there's no conclusion slide here because it was already 20 slides long, but um, I think maybe we very quickly in our society today rip apart the Ten Commandments as, people like Bill Maher talk about saying, if you only had 10 commandments, these wouldn't be the 10 I would have chosen. I would have put in no rape, no genocide, blah, 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 blah. It's not so good. The first three are about God, so what good is that? Well, let's take a step back. Is rape in there? Yes. Adultery and coveting the neighbor's wife. Twice it's in there, right relationship with other people in terms of sexual ethics. Um, how about genocide? Thou shalt not murder. Right? Not only should you not murder a lot of people, you shouldn't even murder one. So that's in there as well. Okay, what else are you going to throw at us? And then in terms of right relationship with God, well, if you're an atheist, then no, you don't want a right relationship with God, I suspect. But if we're talking about what is properly just in the world, well, God has created an amazing planet. He's created our own lives. He's created our parents. He's created our best friends. He's created our children. He's created sunsets and sunrises and giraffes and elephants and hummingbirds and beautiful forests and fruit trees and and oceans and beaches and mountains and creeks and everything imaginable that's beautiful and gorgeous. And you know, all of this has been created for us, in a good long life, and read books and do art and fall in love, and, worship God in these beautiful churches and Latin and chant and right and languages and the Eiffel Tower and just all of it is so amazing that the proper ordering would be just have a right relationship with the creator of it all. Say thank you. um, to not put fake ideas of God before him, not being superstitious or irreligious, but worshiping God as God actually is, um, and taking rest, which particularly helps the poor. Right? These things are not. I don't think they're outdated. Maybe if you take it too literal to the word and you don't really meditate upon them the way that St. Thomas did, you'll misunderstand it. But I think within the Thomistic understanding, the Ten Commandments are particularly beautiful. And if you recall, this is also not the only time that the Ten Commandments are used. You can also look to the Prima Secunda question 100, and it's also in there as well. And if anybody would like to see more spiritual readings on this, I also recommend that the Catechism is pretty extensive on the Ten Commandments. It's just I couldn't put it all in there without it going for 2 hours long. So have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time when we cover fortitude, our next cardinal virtue.